Before we get into today's interview with Richard Hanania, we wanted to ask if you guys could just take a quick moment to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. It'd be super helpful to us for new people finding the show. And also, we could really use some assistance because we got a single 1-star review on Apple Podcasts from an unknown hater troll.
And when n equals 5, one-star review can hurt.
When n equals 4, it can hurt even more. So so if you enjoy what we're doing here, please just take a moment to give us a 5-star rating. And if you don't enjoy what we're doing here, just feel free to stop listening. No need to comment publicly at all. So
yes,
just go along your day. Just never think of us again. Like, don't let us take up room in your brain. Don't let us waste any more of your time. Just don't bother with us if you don't like us. If you do like us, though, 5-star review would be great.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Here's Richard Hanania. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Moral Mayhem. Today, Vaish and I are joined by Richard Hanania, who is a popular political and cultural commentator. He has a big Substack, and he's also the author of The Origins of Woke, which we'll talk about a little bit today. Richard's background is that he has a PhD in political science and a law degree, which I'm sure came in handy for the book. And he's also the father of 2 with a 3rd on the way. So before we get into it, would you mind, Richard, just starting with giving us like a little bit of a high-level idea of your philosophy with respect to being a public intellectual? Who are you trying to talk to? What are the core values you're trying to disseminate? And what's the mechanism of impact that you think is most likely?
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't make it sound more sort of organized or well thought out than it actually is. I think I'm largely driven by things that annoy me on the internet, but sort of tempered by what I think is important and what I think I can have an impact on. And so, yeah, I mean, philosophically, I'm pretty much a classical liberal. I mean, I believe in markets. I believe in freedom. I'm, intrigued and play footsie with some of this rationalist EA stuff. I sort of go back and forth on things like AI alignment and AI risk. I think some of the stuff that gets the most attention and is, as a sort of a culture war commentator. And I focused on that a bit, but it's not as big of an interest as much as it gets attention, because that stuff gets a lot of attention and that stuff sells a lot more than whatever you want to talk about, trade policy or even AI risk or whatever. I mean, just the audience for that is absolutely huge. And I do write about that, and I do have ideas and say things about that. But yeah, I'm basically just someone on the internet saying what I think. It's good work if you can get it.
It's interesting because even from a utilitarian perspective, I do sometimes wonder if obsessing about, especially as a writer, obsessing about your impact and the mechanism is counterproductive, because, a large part of it is just being in touch with your instincts and kind of seeing where that goes. And I'm pretty sure there's some amount of trade-off if you're always trying to follow a top-down process of this is how I want to change the world versus, I'm going to feel my way through this, and obviously without losing sight of, we don't want to talk about pet shelters every day. That would be stupid. But in general, do you think there's a trade-off between kind of listening to yourself and that being translated into a more authentic voice and being more kind of, I don't know, top down and impact focused?
Yeah, I mean, I recently talking to some people who have, giant Twitter followings, 7 figures, and some of them, you'd be surprised, are very deliberate. This gets, they have sort of analytics. They see this gets, their little sort of startups. So this gets attention, this doesn't get attention. So that could be a way to sort of blow up. And maybe it's the most common way to blow up, or you're sort of in touch with people and you just happen to be lucky that you have sort of the same instincts and the same concerns a lot of other people have. I think what's true in what you're saying and what's sort of important to realize is that, you're going to have to find the motivation to do it. So if you're a person, I mean, some people can work on a very boring technical problem for years, and maybe they just care about making money or something, and that can motivate them and they can do it. Some people might approach being a public intellectual or a blogger or whatever in the same way. I've always been sort of driven more by just, saying what I believe and sort of having idealistic concerns, a world I want, and sort of my vision and sort of how I live my life and the ability to express myself. And that's what motivates me. So I think in my case in particular, and maybe people who are like me, they're going to have trouble if they try to think about it too much, if they try to plan too much. I think that would trip me up. Most of my growth is natural, organic, not that I never consider what can get attention or not. But even when I do that, it's always like I have instincts, like, between 3-4 different articles I might want to write, and one I think is going to take off and one is not. I'll choose that. I don't, go out and say, oh, this is a big thing, I have to go write about this. So it's a balance, but I think understanding sort of your own individual psychology and what motivates you, because without motivation to keep working and producing content and producing things that are compelling, you're not going to get anywhere anyway.
I have a question on something you alluded to earlier about your values, right? And I read like most of your stuff. So the thing I'm confused about is I know you identify yourself with the right, but you're obviously, not more than willing to criticize the left. But on a metapolitical level, what do you think you're trying to do? Are you trying to get more right-wingers or conservatives or Republicans as to kind of see reason in, let's say, the issues that are obvious and the left is right about? Or are you trying to win over centrists, like center-left people, to kind of vote Republican?
Yeah.
Like, I guess that, it depends on what your beliefs about those two parties are, but I'm interested in kind of like, what do you think is more plausible there?
This doesn't conform to social desirability bias. But one problem with people being stupid is you sort of can't fix it. And sort of trying to make stupid people smarter is probably not a great, is not a great investment of time. What you can try to do is sort of talk to people who are interested in truth and interested in sort of an attitude and bring them sort of to your view. So yes, there's this endogeneity thing, like the right has a sort of a brains problem, and it's not just that they're just like stupid or on average or anything like that. It's like it's the more the issue, there is a lack of intellectual curiosity. A really smart right winger might become like an executive at an oil company or something, rather than becoming a journalist making $80,000 a year and just really influencing the public in that way. And so conservatism has a problem where like it doesn't attract smart, idealistic people. Like that's the thing. That's the smart, and if someone is smart and idealistic, like they are overwhelmingly 90% chance they're probably on the left in any Western country, probably. And I want to change that. And what you could, and so by showing, but first of all, modeling. Look, I can be smart and be conservative, and so for the there's modeling. Also, I think that there is a sort of there's also, I think I'm in touch with the American right. It's like the global right at this point, in terms of sort of the things that bother them and sort of their instincts and how they approach all this. Not all of it. I mean, there is this sort of, this is weird. But when young boys have sex with their teachers, half of the right says you are ridiculous for even considering a crime. Half of the right says this is pedophilia and we need to bring the hammer down on these women. And to me, this is the fundamental psychological divide on the right. I know it's stupid to say this is the psychological, but everyone was in the former position 20 years ago. The latter position is very, I just find very distasteful, very stupid, and correlated with a lot of other bad things. And so, I want to sort of expel or sort of bring people along as much as I can, because people are mostly motivated by, sort of their emotional reactions to things. There's a kind of conservatism that is sort of conspiratorial, that is parochial, that is small-minded, that is reactive to what the left is doing, that is paranoid. We don't need that. We need something better. And but like at the same time, like I am pissed off by many of the same things you guys are pissed. I think, you take it too far, or like you're a little bit too petty, or maybe you prioritize it too much. But at the same time, like, yeah, I don't like a lot of the cultural changes that have occurred in Western societies in the last 20 or 30 years. And I think people can realize that, even though it's very weird, like, Nick Fuentes says, like, I'm his favorite Substack, and like, I have nothing in common with Nick Fuentes. I mean, it's amazing. Like, I'm sort of amazed by this, because I'm always trolling his followers too, and saying, you guys are anti-Semitic and stupid. And it's amazing. Sometimes people like you when you tell them that stuff. But I do think I do have that sort of. But that's how you're going to be effective. You're going to have to sort of somehow, in some sort of, even if you can't, you might not agree with people in like even like in a very deep philosophical sense, or like your stated policy positions, and you might think that they have a terrible effect on society. But I think I just sort of end up on the right, or end up influencing the right, because I think people can sort of see where my instincts are.
Yeah, I think that this, to me, brings to mind, like, there's sort of this traditionally psychologically conservative person who would be the person who's the executive and not talking about culture. And a lot of those people would be voting Democrat at this point and just not engaging very much. I worked with those kind of people in finance where, like, they're just not interested. They just want to, like, do their thing, not have drama, and they might not like the cultural changes, but they're not necessarily incensed by them either. And yeah, I don't see you as fitting into that at all, like, as having sort of the conservative mindset, because you're very technophilic, don't seem to be super, like, discuss sensitive or fear driven in sort of your positions, which I associate with some of the more trad stuff, like the, lab grown meat ban, anti-reproductive tech. That strand of conservatism to me is, like, very psychologically conservative, which happens to fall on the right wing. Whereas what you're representing is more the libertarian stuff, which has ended up being coded as right wing in the US. But then you also do take more traditionally socially conservative positions. And so, like, I guess what I'm wondering is, why do you end up there? And why is it that in terms of social positions, you feel more confident that you can see that people are making decisions that are bad for them? Whereas, like, in the economic sense, you generally would be very libertarian. People can know what kind of positive sum transactions are there, and that sort of thing, if that question makes sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. The disgust instinct thing. I think I do have the disgust instinct. Like, I watch videos of people you see this on Twitter. You see these videos from 1980s and 1990s or something. Like, what do you notice, right? And I think you're supposed to be racist and say everyone is white and now they're not white and how terrible this is. But whenever I watch sort of a 1980s video or something, it's like, the people, I'm disgusted by tattoos. I'm disgusted by unnatural hair colors. But at some point I realized that, like, supporting Trump is not how you get rid of these things. That's not, there's like I think a lot of these people just are angry of, like, the way the people look and the way the people behave. And then they go to, like, sort of right wing conspiracy theories, or just right wing sort of tribalism. And so and I don't have the instinct on biotech. So I think there's probably the disgust instinct I've thought a bit about. There's two things. There's like an egalitarian, anti-egalitarian. Like, I think some people are just disgusted by rabid egalitarianism. I think some people are just disgusted by the idea as we're going to treat everything the same, even though things are not the same, and some things are good and some things are bad. So I have that very strongly. It's correlated with this other thing, which is the naturalistic fallacy, which I don't have. But at the same time, like, I don't know, like, I like men who look like men and women who look like women. And I sort of think that everyone does. I sort of think that this is just something that human beings suppress. Maybe I'm just more honest than other people, because I think your average person would want their son to be traditionally masculine and attractive, and their daughter to be traditionally feminine. And I think people will say otherwise because they sort of have to for social desirability reasons. Maybe I'm not that high on that sort of disgust instinct. I think I might perhaps be more honest. And then your question, Reagan, about whether I can be, it's I don't know, being free market is not about trusting people's choices to be, perfect and they can't make mistakes. It's more distrust of government relatively. And I do distrust government. I would distrust the government in social sphere. I mean, I think there's many social things I don't like, and I don't ask the government to fix it. I think people are often mistaken, and we should be trying to convince them. But government also has bad incentives and has bad knowledge problem, and it might not necessarily share the values that I have too. So I mean, I think it's pretty consistent. I trust people more than government, and I think there's some things people should be doing and some things they should probably not be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the reason I ask is because I think that I often think that sort of the socially conservative lifestyle is preferable for the majority of people. So I agree with social conservatives on that. But I think that, at least online, there's a lot of quickness to doubt heterogeneous preferences where I don't think it's justified. And I'm not saying you do that because, like, obviously you do talk to trans women and gay people and whatever. It's not like you're in who you interact with super fine-grained or right-wing traditionally. But yeah, I think like with some of the slut-shaming stuff and things like that, I think being honest about sex differences and all this kind of stuff is really important. But at the same time, I don't think we need to make people feel bad about being weird if they're weird. I don't think we should try to convince people that they're weird if they're not, which I think is where the concern is coming from. But also, a lot of people are weird. So, yeah.
I mean, you might ask, where we are as a society. I mean, whether what should we make people feel bad for being weird? I don't know. I mean, we just, we're still in Pride Month, and and Brian Kaplan recently, his last blog post said, you would think you lived in basically a one-party state where everyone worships, homosexuality. You walk through the streets of the big cities, and it's everywhere. And so I don't know. Like, I think we've overcorrected a lot. I think if we're gonna choose between sort of, like how many portrayals on TV do you get of like people who are like 19 or 20 or in their early 20s and like getting married and starting families? That used to be like a normal sitcom. It's not anymore, right? Like someone just having a regular home life. I don't know if there's any sitcoms like that. I mean, some of them have been grandfathered in, like The Simpsons or Family Guy, these things that go on for 30, 40 years. I mean, you couldn't even make them today, but because they're cartoons, they can last forever. And so, yeah, I mean, these people, they have a reaction to this, and they go straight to, shame women and start, putting them in the town square and laughing at them and, making every homosexual tell them they're a deviant. And look, I think that liberals, they have a sense that like, there's a lot of people out there really itching to go gay bashing. Like as soon as you give them permission, they're going to do that. And attack promiscuous women. I think that's right. I think that instinct is sort of always part of human nature, and always there. And so, yeah, we should be cognizant of that. At the same time, like, where is mainstream society, right? That's the question. And where would we necessarily want it to go?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree on the lack of representation of like happy mothers in general is not very helpful for the culture. The only place I've seen that recently is Bridgerton, and they set it in a period setting, and then there's a bunch of girl boss narratives as well to count. But one of the daughters actually wanted to get married.
Yeah, fantasy is a way to sort of I have a I forget what the article's called, but yeah, there's a cultural escapism. So if you look at like the golden age of TV, you either put it in the past or you put it in like a criminal underworld. So you put something like Sopranos, or you do something like Mad Men, or Game of Thrones before the last season where it just went off the rails and became infected by this stuff. So you're right. There is. I've never watched Bridgerton. I can't get over like they just randomly had to insert black people. Like they just couldn't like make a show where like they didn't make like, they just couldn't stand it. Like British people who are all white, like, no, that's just too hard. I could never, I just had such a bad reaction to that. But yeah, that would be another example.
Did you watch Three Body Problem? We started watching it, and like within 10 minutes, I was like, really? Like, there's 5 physicists, and 3 of them are black, and 2 are women.
Not only women, it was beautiful women.
Yeah.
I'm like, there's not this many beautiful female physicists out there.
Yeah, I saw a Twitter meme that just showed like, here are the scientists from Three Body Problem, and that probably inclined me not to watch.
Yeah, someone said that about Station, like we were at Manifest, and someone said that about Station 11, which it's funny that I actually liked the show and I didn't like notice the diversity loading when I was watching it, but
Yeah,
it's probably
I don't know what Station 11 is.
it's like it's a novel by this woman Emily Mandel that got turned into a show. It was like prescient because she wrote it like a year before the pandemic, and it's sort of speculative fiction, and then the premise is a severe pandemic, kind of the types that EA types warn about, that kills off like most of the population. There's like a small pool of people left to kind of rebuild, and it's their it's just their story. It's pretty good actually. I really liked it.
Yeah, just last thing I wanted to say, Bridgerton is certainly not anti-woke. I'm just saying that one of the daughters has the desire for marriage, marries, and is happy. So
okay, you get one of them. Did you see the Catherine the Great mini? It's like a mini series. It's a very strange thing. It's a comedy. It's Catherine the Great. It's a comedy, but it has this girl boss narrative, and like they're like, oh, just have sex, and her like, it's actually very funny. It made me laugh. They have in the Russian nobility, and what is it? This is the 18th century. They just have a random black guy and a random Indian, and it drove me crazy. It's funny. It's like so absurd. It's like sort of absurdist humor. I actually sort of like the show, and only the Indian guy is sort of a little bit has some like prominent role, but the black guy is just sort of in the background. But this stuff just it's like Pushkin I think was a quarter or whatever, but it wasn't that. It was like a full black guy. I mean it's ridiculous. Like why do you feel the need to do this? I mean
that's particularly bad because that's an actual historical drama. At least if there's like some fantasy element you can defend it. But anyway, should we get into the book a little bit? Okay, so starting with, so basically the thesis of your book is that the cultural wokeness is very importantly supported by legal systems related to civil rights law, but you talk a lot about not the sort of original intention of the Civil Rights Act, but the various ways in which it was extended, interpreted, and in which precedent was set over the following decades. So could you just like give a high level summary of that, and also talk about where did the sort of activist class and all of the things that led to it being extended in the ways in which it was, where do you think that was generated? Because that part was sort of separate from the original legal basis and the just general populace opinion on these topics.
Yeah, I mean, I think people sometimes think that they read the book and they think that I just dismiss sort of the ideas, the sort of driving force behind all this. And I think that you have to understand both. You have to understand the ideas, and you have to understand sort of the bureaucratic and legal sort of history here. And that latter part is underexplored. And that's why I think the book was important. I think that people, there's a lot of cultural analysis of sort of what's going on in left-wing people's heads when they're pushing for wokeness, whether in race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever. And yeah, I mean, and so yeah, the idea was American history. And I don't know if this is even like American history because, we can start with that before we get to other societies. American history, I mean, has had a race problem obviously since the beginning. I mean, America had a civil war over it. Then we had the 1960s, and it's always been an issue, what to do with the black population and with violent differences between different parts of the country. We still remain divided based on racial issues. And so there was sort of inevitable. There would be there was legislation to help blacks right after the Civil War, right in the 1860s. So like it was inevitable that this was probably going to happen. There would be more legislation to try to help blacks at some point in our history. At the same time, a lot of this other stuff that government ended up doing is very historically contingent, like why we have disparate impact standard instead of like racial quotas. That's a very interesting story. It didn't have to work out that way. Why we have anti-discrimination laws so strenuously applied to all other groups. That didn't necessarily have to be the case. Why did we have to sort of, John Screntny, the sociologist, says the civil rights movement basically created the category of minorities. There was no minorities. I mean, there was Native Americans and there were blacks in America, but then there were whites, obviously, but like the idea of a minority is like a bureaucratic class that the federal government thinks about and takes notice of and tries to help. That was practically new. And so, yes, this is the story. And then you get into like, just like very specifics of the American state. Like, why are college campuses the place where we regulate sex most of all? Like, why is the federal government obsessed with like women's sports? Like, why is this like such an issue that the federal government deals with? It didn't have to be that way. And there's a lot of things that the American government could be doing, that it doesn't do, as far as race and gender, but it does do these kind of weird things. And I think there's a legal and bureaucratic history, and there's a broader story about how this is not some kind of unfolding plan. There's sort of a bureaucratic and legal logic that sort of leads in this direction.
But does a lot of this contingency though flow through like special interests or specific constituencies, whether that's within the bureaucracy or the electorate, pushing for and trying to make this a priority? Because like if it does flow through that, then I guess we're in some ways back to kind of trying to find a cultural explanation for why these groups happen to have positions of influence or something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So yeah, civil rights law is sort of, it's the pipeline from ideas and sort of academia to governing policy and actually controlling the private sector and controlling people's lives. So yes, you're right. I mean, the idea of trans people being protected under a Civil Rights Act, which just banned sex. Congress never passed. They tried to, but Congress never passed even a sexual orientation protection. So there's no federal law under banning sexual orientation, but basically it became that way through court decisions relatively late. And so. Yeah, I mean, it is a, these ideas are sort of worthwhile, but a lot of times it goes in the opposite direction that people might think. So like, it'll go like, government will decide that tests are racist or whatever. And then people will have an entire cottage industry of telling you why tests are racist, or, criminal justice stuff. Maybe that was inevitable, but the diversity stuff is very interesting because that was sort of created by government fiat. That was a Supreme Court decision. And then you see the mentions of diversity take off, and it becomes sort of the idea that all universities are sort of grabbing onto in order to justify what they want to do. So there's this general sort of white guilt, and we're the good people who help minorities. And then like this stuff can be, pushed in one direction or another, depending on sort of political outcomes and what else is going on in the bureaucracy and in courts.
Yeah, and then I guess like once you attach moral value, like I think the one piece of this is maybe because people didn't. I mean, we don't have hindsight, so presumably the muted response of like centrists and conservatives to that, while probably rational at the time, it just now seems like a big mistake, right? Because like essentially what's happened is you attach kind of righteousness or moral good to something, and at least at the surface it's sort of like easy to justify why generally diversity makes sense, or like there's these catchphrases that are hard to sort of like pin down and criticize even at like a surface level, and people probably didn't want to do that. And once you attach morality to it, then there's a race to the bottom, as you point out in your book, right? Like which company wants to be the only one that's not meeting the bar on like basic decency.
Yeah, but the diversity thing, what you're saying is sort of there's a Darwinian competition between ideas, and like that was the thing where you could do the thing that sort of people in the government wanted to do, but which would cause the least explicit backlash, right? Because racial quotas have always been unpopular, and sort of the idea that you can discriminate against people to make up for past, that the courts have rejected that, and most of American public opinion rejects that. And so this idea of diversity, I mean, it's funny. I mean, it was invented in the late 1970s, pretty much, and then Republicans and conservatives don't. I mean, it works for 30 years. They don't say anything bad about diversity. It works so well. It's like, this is just an idea that means you are nice to people who are different and you are not intolerant. And it becomes a sort of virtue that's widely accepted. They wake up. I mean, around in the 2010s sometime, they actually wake up and they say, oh, wait, this, and they really, the Great Awakening, I mean, they really overreached with this stuff. I mean, they the idea that states would be abolishing DEI bureaucracies, unthinkable 10 years ago. I mean, but they really, really woke people up, and they were able to see sort of what's going on here. But yeah, I mean, it was remarkably successful for, 3 decades. Nobody sort of caught on.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the waking up was just people, like anyone who's worked in a corporate environment has seen it firsthand, just how pervasive it is. But one of the things that's interesting that you talk about with respect to diversity is also just which racial categories count, and the way that those were also contingently constructed by various government decisions at various points in time, and like the American, what is it, Asian and American Pacific Islander category, for example, like what a, you know, and then I think Arabs are still counted as white, and anyway, there's all kinds of like weird things with respect to which races count anyway. But in terms of the logic behind why people didn't want to push back on diversity, the idea that, I think that the idea could be, and people say it is, it's that race is a visible proxy for diversity of thought in some kind of way, which will turn into beneficial business outcomes. And, you know, in my experience at a previous employer, when we had a diverse manager project where we were trying to hire more diverse fund managers, for example, this was the logic. Like, if you went and said, oh, this is for social justice, this is why we want to do it, we want to give them extra points for social justice reasons because our clients care about social justice, that was totally verboten. And the line was, no, it's just because it's this useful proxy. And then, you know, when I'd be in a meeting and I'd be like, well, why don't we consider white Eastern European immigrants that are male to be diverse then? Because surely that should be a better proxy for diversity of thought than, you know, a black guy from Harvard or an Asian guy from Harvard. Anyway, and it's just, everyone knows that this is what's happening, yet it's still unspoken. And so anyway, I don't know how that got convinced to be sort of the ethical position, or I don't know what percentage of people still believe that it is truly about diversity and diversity of thought, and what percentage believe it's, you know, what percentage are just saying the useful things that they don't get in trouble. But anyway,
I think what you'll realize until recently, until maybe 2019, white Americans are very uncomfortable talking about race, just very uncomfortable. And so you have these demands for representation. You will inspire a bit of a backlash if you say we're going to discriminate against people top of. And so the diversity thing was a way to sort of let people not think about it too much and just allow some groups to sort of get advantages, but pretend like it's a positive sum outcome and everyone's better off. And it just makes business sense. This is what we would do anyway, even if there was no history of racial discrimination in America and so forth. This was like an equilibrium for a long time. It was broken, I think, by both sides, but in a sort of spiral where the left became more explicit, like you need to check your white privilege, and conservatives became more hostile to that. I think probably the left went first, and then the right-wing reaction came later. And so, I think this was like people were just very, very uncomfortable. But then eventually it became a point where the left really started making this stuff explicit, and that was actually a bad idea. But they're not some unified group thinking rational strategy. It just sort of had this theological kind of development, and it inevitably led to a backlash. And this is going to be bad for wokeness in the long run. 2019, 2020 is going to be bad for wokeness in the long run because it made it an explicit political issue that divided the two major parties.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about that. You kind of said it now, which is, if you think about it as an equilibrium that was achieved because like a bunch of things were reinforcing each other, like any other equilibrium, right? Like you have something sets it off, but then there's reinforcing loops between, mostly due to social conformity and other things. It should be that the more kind of like leverage there is in that system, the easier it is to unwind on the way down as well, right? Like you pull something off and then things would stop, start unwinding. I'm not articulating this super well, but I think of it somewhat as like financial leverage, right? Like when you buy something with debt, and like on the way up, you get like double the return, but then if things go down, you lose big. And there's something like that with like things that are sort of reinforced by social pressures, because as soon as you unwind one, the bluff has been called in public, if that makes sense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, and just the fact that so many people were falsifying for so long that, there's a huge silent majority that already thinks this, is already convinced about this stuff, that just wasn't speaking about it. And, who the people you can talk to at work are and all that kind of stuff. So that's why I do agree that once it gets out into the open, it becomes, there's so many people that have been waiting to be honest about what they think about what's going on, that
Yeah, in an office environment, it's like the thing where I think we've talked about this, where you kind of you drop, if you're someone who's not super woke, you just you drop like very small steps. You say statement X, which is sort of like, trying to bait the other person into saying something else, and then you slowly then stake out your normal positions, and then you can be friends.
This is how a lot of socializing works. I was thinking dating, and someone messaged me with some dating advice. He's like, this thing happened, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm going to see this girl again. Should I hit on her again? And I told him, this is not a binary. When you try to meet a woman, it's you put something out there, she reciprocates or she doesn't reciprocate. It's always on a spectrum what you're doing. And so this is social interactions. I think generally, I think you've stumbled on a sort of a theory of how people communicate. And yes, it does work for sort of ideas, and political values. Yeah, I'm interested that you guys saw it so clearly in the corporate environment, because with the Scott Alexander review of my book, and then he had a highlights to the comments of the review, and then a lot of people were saying, I mean, there was a wide variation. Some people say this is everywhere in corporate America, and some people say I never saw any of this. And so, yeah, it's interesting to get sort of people's different perspectives.
Yeah, I saw both. I saw at my first employer, our clients were colleges and universities. So it was more prevalent there because there was, and there I think it's fair because if our clients have a social justice demand, then the business should serve that. Whether they should have a social justice demand is another case. But so that at that employer, it was much more explicit. And then at my second employer, it was like becoming more explicit. But I mean, yeah, at best, when I'm saying it wasn't as explicit at the second employer, it was still like you could talk as much as you wanted about very far left things. You couldn't talk at all about conservative things. So there was still.
And what was this? This was a finance company, and where?
New York.
Okay, so New York finance, got it.
Most people are not far left in New York at all. I mean, in finance, it's just that they're conformist and they're focused on their career and they're not interested in having any kind of slightly hot discussion within the workplace. I just see where you remember that clip from maybe 2016, 2017 or something, where Trump walks into these, I think it was supposed to be rich New Yorkers in this restaurant, and they all stand up and start clapping for him. I don't know how representative that was, but it's sort of a classic clip from early the Trump era. Not what I have seen here, but
I was gonna say, just even if you look at like what happened to Bill Ackman, right? We saw him speak at the TED conference, and I'd followed him on Twitter because of all the Israel stuff. But it was interesting, as much as I agree with him now, it was interesting to me that this guy just like seemed to be asleep through all of this. He was like discovering like wokeness all afresh, and it was a delight to watch.
Yeah.
But I'm like,
Yeah, I mean, people don't care. People just like, okay, when you hear about like a benefit for veterans or a benefit for disabled. Now, I'm woke on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I know what big disability, the harms it does to society. But I think most people just see, veterans, disabled. They've seen the minority stuff and women stuff like that too. It was just a sort of all American kind of, general, like you recycle, like you put, things in this bin instead of that bin. Quotas, would have been politically controversial, but people just sort of saw it in that way. And now it's explicitly political. It can't be as powerful if it's explicitly political. The most powerful things are things that are seen as non-political, just things that all nice people believe in. And it's been polarized, so that changes things.
Yeah, I think we should talk about the Disabilities Act part in a little bit. But before we move on, I realize that we haven't really explained the disparate impact versus quotas thing. So the disparate impact was that any hiring process which was shown to have disparate impact on different races or the different sexes could be legally questionable and had to be proven that it was a process related to the job itself rather than some general competence test. And you were saying that we would have been better off if we allowed any kind of hiring practices and skimmed off the top quotas of each group than what we ended up with, which is less successful processes for getting the highest merit candidate into the role. Is that a good summary?
It's it's hard to say whether overall whether it would have been better or worse. I do make the case that there are advantages that people don't necessarily think of that are rooted in civil rights law. So when you can't give an IQ test because some groups do better than the others, it sort of takes IQ tests off the table. Quotas, where you do racial norming. And it was actually more left-wing people wanted to do that. More left-wing people, it's not like they were started by a motivation that they hated tests. They didn't really have one way or the other as far as tests, but the tests weren't giving them the results that they wanted. And so a lot of left-wing people in like the EEOC, they actually wanted to do race norming, where you would just give blacks a few extra points and then you would, get the numbers that way. And so this is applying to IQ tests, but it's a broad principle that just for anything you use to select people, if you just give people a little bit of a bonus or you give them a quota and you do it explicitly, it's different than this. It's possibly better than this sort of subjective process that takes merit more off the table. Now, there's other reasons why you might not want a quota system. First of all, diversity might be more successful. You might actually have a lot more incompetent people getting ahead because you just have a quota. And so you don't have power. So you look at like top executives and like, they're still not that diverse from the perspective of, diversity of what leftists would like to see. And then like, I don't know, do you politicize the workplace more by making maybe there's something to be said about this stuff sort of being under the radar and being soft and a little bit subjective and everyone being experiencing a little bit of cognitive dissonance. I don't know. It's a complicated question. But yeah, that's arguably the quotas would have just been better.
But it's weird to me that like the counterfactual that we're seeing would have involved quotas, especially in like, I agree with you on the in let's say academia or in colleges, but it's sort of like strange that we would have any of this debate in corporations. So I kind of like compare and contrast with India, which is interesting because it's a country where there's a lot more political support for quotas, and there are quotas, right, in like government jobs and colleges, but obviously none in private sectors. And it's culturally the high status thing or view to espouse as being anti-quotas and anti-affirmative action in general, right? Which is but like we know we'll never get rid of affirmative action.
I didn't know that. It doesn't apply to the private sector. It's just colleges and government.
There are no quotas in like if you start a company, you don't have to.
Do you have anything like civil rights law? Anything that government bothers you?
It's interesting. I haven't. I don't know. It's also just not as litigious as a society as the U.S. So I wonder if you'd be able to get any juice by suing companies. That's just generally less.
That sort of makes me bullish on India. I mean, the private sector is going to be a lot more competent than government and education. And if you look at sort of society as a competition between these forces of freedom and these forces of sort of stagnation, like maybe you want them to be as hobbled and as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's already. I think the state in India is actually contrary to popular belief. It's there's way fewer like government employees per thousand people. There's about 16 per thousand people, and in the US it's like 77, right? So it's like the state is actually quite small, and it's not efficacious, which needs to change. But I think the flip side of that is things happen despite the government, not because of it.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you one quick thing on the India point. Do you think that that's because, at least my perception of Indian culture is that there is more of an explicit acknowledgement of like differential ability? Like people don't mind being like, oh, that guy, their son is super, I don't know, like there's a lot of standardized testing. There's a lot of like explicit talking about how people look and perform anyway.
Yeah, I think Reagan got a taste of it when she visited my family in India. They're not shy at all to talk about how people look or how smart someone is. And it's just, even the thing you were saying about like expressing a preference for your sons to look masculine and your, women to look beautiful. It's you see it in almost every culture which has not been sanitized, which obviously has its downsides, right? I'm not praising Indian culture overall. There's on net, I don't know that like our culture is like a winning thing, but I think in the economic sphere, there's definitely like, do you know the IITs, which is like the most selective technical school in India? It's like basically has acceptance rates like lower than MIT, and it's all through a standardized test. And in the newspapers back in the day, like the guys who topped the top 5 guys who got into IITs, and they were always guys, they would appear in the front pages of the newspaper, right? So like the celebration of success, and I thought that it was limited to academic achievement, but now they celebrate startups. So this is something that makes me bullish, right? Like people are genuinely excited for people to move ahead, and even amongst the lower classes in urban environments, you just see like a lot more technophilia and just being positive on the future, which is something that's like depressing here, right?
Yeah, probably because they've seen material gains over the past couple decades, right? Switching gears a little bit, you make sort of like the libertarian case for not preventing discrimination. So actually, let me rewind for 1 second. So the original Civil Rights Act was supposed to prevent explicit discrimination based on race. They, as you laid in the book, they were very clear about this is not going to imply quotas. This is not going to imply all the things which it did sort of softly end up implying through how it was interpreted over the subsequent decades. But you also, like from a libertarian perspective, I think, don't support the original civil rights law outside of sort of government institutions, I would assume. You talk about the potential for free association to lead to new kinds of workplaces where, some are more social, some are more open to inter-workplace dating, some are whatever, various types of things. As some are discriminated against women, some discriminated against other races and all this stuff. And I think that looking at things as they stand right now, that sounds attractive to me in a lot of ways. But I do think about it from the meritocratic perspective of there really was a lot of talent that was trapped and that wasn't able to, at least this is my perception of it. I just watched the Ruth Bader Ginsburg movie where she's the top Harvard law student. She can't get a job anywhere as a lawyer. She ends up having to work as an academic because nobody will hire a woman. And yeah, I don't know. Do you think there's any case that these laws allowed an expansion of meritocratic incentives that would have been hard to achieve without some sort of legal intervention?
I mean, it must have to a certain extent. Whether that was a major effect of them, I don't know. I mean, because you look at so you could talk about race and you could talk about sex. You could talk about race, first of all. I mean, in the 1960s, Chinese and Japanese already had higher incomes than white Americans, right? So whatever discrimination was going on did not influence. So yes, I think markets are quite meritocratic in that sense, that if a group is productive, they're going to get wealthier. I mean, blacks were doing better after the Civil Rights Act, but they were doing before, in the decades before the Civil Rights Act. So that was going to happen. And then the women thing, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the attitudes were at the time. It could have been rational. It could have been in the sense that they thought that women were going to all get married and have children, and that's not something they wanted to deal with. And is a cultural norm that women are going to get married and have children, and we expect them. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. In and of itself, does it lead to some women not fulfilling their full potential? Maybe. But, that's a trade-off. I'm not, that uncomfortable with that trade-off. We're so far away from that world, though. We're so far away from a world where everyone expects women to get married young and have children that it's sort of an academic point. I'm political sort of realist, even though I don't like the anti-freedom of association parts of the Civil Rights Act. I don't tell people that they have to go and repeal the whole Civil Rights Act like Chris Caldwell, because this all was done incrementally. I mean, we see incremental sort of changes can reshape society. And so I think incremental changes in the other way, you're basically, I don't have a problem with telling people this is sort of my ideal. Like, you really should believe in freedom, even when freedom sounds bad, when it sounds like, this is going to give people the right to discriminate based on race and sex. First of all, you should believe in people's rights to do what they want with their private property. Second, you should believe in the market for punishing bad behavior, for taxing people's making them face their consequences of their own actions, and providing competition to incentivize better behavior. So yeah, it's possible. I mean, it helps somebody along the way. Sure.
Yeah. No, I just feel like that, with the women issue at least, it's like some of it was that women did need to go into some positions and show that some women are able to do some of these positions. And that's always going to be a minority of women that want to be a top lawyer or whatever anyways. But, I think that at that like pre-civil rights law, there really was the perception that women are going to get their periods and not be able to like be emotionally stable enough to have difficult
Look,
employment positions.
so we
Think,
went straight from everyone thinking women can't do everything to everyone thinking women can do everything, and everyone has to legally believe that. I want an economy where half the companies say no women and half the companies say all women, and a third of the companies say half men and half women. And these are all testable things. Like, we should see, like, maybe, who knows, you add women to a finance company or whatever, maybe it ruins things, maybe it makes things better. I have no freaking idea, right? Well, all women, what would an all women finance? I don't know. Like, I want a world where we're just free to figure these things out, because I just have no idea what the best race or sex or corporate culture is. That's above my pay grade. That's above anyone's pay grade. And yeah, I want freedom to explore these things.
yeah. I mean, I generally, especially when I think about if I were starting my own company or it was a small company, my intuitions are totally there. I just sometimes I'm like, I wonder if we needed a little bit of a jolt to the system to sort of give people more ability to express their talents in the market. Yeah, as for the feminization of the workplace, I also don't know what the optimal level is. I feel like my experience in the asset management companies I was in was that probably it had gone slightly too feminine, but had probably been better than it was in the 80s, and in a lot of other places probably way too feminine. But yeah, that's also a lot of it is like you said, a lot of it's personal preference. Like, I want to work in a type of workplace where you can tell someone when they did something wrong very directly and that kind of thing, and other people want to work in a workplace where it's very sensitive. So yeah, anyway, did you have anything else on the book to get to? I was gonna. Oh, actually, sorry. Let's talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act quickly before we move on. Can you just talk a little bit about the reasonable accommodation clause or
Yeah.
interpretation?
I had a section on the Americans with Disabilities Act in my book, and I don't remember much from it, to be honest. So I refer people to the book. Yes, I remember the ADA was pretty ridiculous and tyrannical and had major costs, but I'm like not in position to talk about the details anymore.
Well, I just was reading some part of it, so I will just say
Okay,
that.
you know it better than me.
But one of the things you talked about, and you alluded to it before, was that this was sort of the last to be politicized, and it took a lot longer to be politicized, which is why those are sort of the most recent legal changes that we've seen. But I guess I would just say my experience of being in the workplace is that the specter of the reasonable accommodation stuff really does influence, especially the mental health treatment.
Yeah.
Even when people are, clearly not performing, and there's just such a fear of firing anyone who has anxiety or, these conditions where like probably 60% of people would say they have, anxiety or whatever. It's like, yes, lots of people have anxiety, and but to me, it's all about I don't think there should be any sort of accommodations at all. Like, I think either you can do the job or you can't do the job effectively, and that should be it. And if we want to support disabled people, we should do that through social support systems that we vote on somewhere else, not through businesses subsidizing people they happen to hire.
Yeah, it's coming back to me a little bit now. Yes, it doesn't, like discrimination in the Civil Rights Act, it doesn't define disability. And there was a Supreme Court case where they found nearsightedness was not a disability because it was like, it was like a third of Americans were nearsighted or something like that. And then the Congress goes and passes a law that overrules the Supreme Court and says, no, there's no limit on how many people can be disabled, because the court did the thing where they went back to the original Americans with Disabilities Act and they found the number, like in the preamble to the bill. It said, 20 million people suffer from, or something like that. It had a number. And it was like the Supreme Court was reasoning, if you include people who need glasses, then that's way more. And so that couldn't have been what Congress intended. And this was under the Bush administration. They go back and they pass a law saying we Congress renounced this idea that there could be any art. No one's paying attention to like how crazy and stupid this is. And so like alcoholism, can be something you have to accommodate. Every kind of mental illness. even the stuff that like people are more sympathetic to. I mean, like how much parking space is just wasted. I mean, the percentage of GDP it took to sort of refit like all the buildings. I remember somebody's telling me at the University of Chicago Law School, they had to like install a special elevator, and it was sitting there for 25 years, and like there was never a person who needed to use that elevator. I mean, it was like it was really a ridiculous thing. So yeah, I mean, it's just this idea that this is a nice thing to do, and nobody really thought of trade-offs, and it was wasteful. But then, of course, it got expanded like everything, and came to cover subjective mental illnesses and so forth.
Yeah, and it like privileges some. I mean, at the end of the day, like everything that's going on in your mind, the ideas you have, your upbringing you have, it all affects like your ability to produce, right? So it's like just super arbitrary to privilege some types of things over other types of things. Like if I had anal fissures and I was just horny all the time at work, like that's, it's probably more inhibiting. But
yeah, you could try it. I mean, if you find a doctor who tells you, I mean, the service animals. I mean, yeah, I mean, you could, all it takes is a doctor to say anything, and that becomes a medical issue. I mean, it's crazy. And that's what courts are for. They figure it out. Yeah, I don't want a society like that. Right. Exactly. If people have problems, deal with their problems. Don't make this into a thing we're always litigating.
Yeah. But I wonder if like some of that, again, I haven't worked in like a corporate setting in the US to know, and maybe Reagan would know, but like, I don't know what percentage of this sort of trepidation around mental health is culture versus, fear of litigation. Because there's also just this like mental health culture, which is, as soon as someone says they're depressed or something, it's also just as long as that word carries weight, it becomes very impregnable. Like you can't really ask too many questions. You can't inspect it further. You just sort of have to take it at face value. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, Abigail, this is getting to the idea of just sort of mental health and sort of what the concept and sort of what it's meant for society. Yeah, Abigail Schreier's book, Bad Therapy, is pretty good on this. Yeah, and I'm convinced by his thesis that basically navel gazing and thinking about mental health all the time hasn't been good for sort of people's psyche.
Yeah, I liked the thing you wrote about the your advice to young men on why they should, how they should process the anxiety that one feels while hitting on someone. But I think I knew you were being like facetious, but I think that same thing is actually pretty useful in a variety of contexts.
No, I'm not
right?
being facetious. That's a serious advice piece.
Yeah, no, I know, but I'm saying like it generalizes way beyond like hitting on girls, right? I mean, like if you have anxiety, it's like your body is telling you that you're in some existential
hitting
crisis.
on girls is sort of you solve that, you could solve the other, because everything else is sort of easy. I think that's the most nervousness that males experience. Women, I don't know if women can understand it or don't understand, but yeah, it's males are the pursuers, and you're sort of putting yourself out there when you're trying to hit on someone. Probably a woman hitting on a guy is maybe weirder because the rejection is sort of worse. It sort of looks desperate. But women don't even probably consider doing that anyway. So it's
but like you said, I think the logic or the evolutionary logic you described there is something like, well, usually there's if it was a high status woman you were hitting on, someone close, some high status man close to her might be around, and it might be, and I think another version of that is that when you only interact with a few women, like 3 out of like the 6 women in your neighborhood rejecting you is like, well, you're a genetic dead end, right? Like you're not going to find anyone else.
And people all know each other, so everyone knows everything you're doing too. So if you look bad, if something bad happens, I mean, that's also a concern too. So yes, you've been wired for too much anxiety. I think that's probably clear, because people feel like these things are life and death when they're objectively nothing happens to you if you get rejected or embarrassed in some way.
Yeah, let's. We wanted to talk about some of your fertility stuff. I think a good segue would be. I know this was Reagan's question, but I'll just go with it since I have the mic. Which is, you seem to sort of like favor the. I'm simplifying, but you seem to favor kind of the culture explanation and. Juxtaposed with some of the economic or policy related discussions that people have, and I think we both have a sort of push back in different, maybe not with you, but I think our perspective on this is that sure, it's culture like anything else, but culture is such a like all-encompassing term that basically captures the way like people interact with each other and the norms and expectations. And so, do we get anywhere if we and like, economics, technology, all of that influences culture, right? So I wonder why there's this like tendency amongst the pronatalist crowd to like kind of reject most tangible proposals of what to do with, well, we have to change the culture. I'm like, well, but the culture is not like this one small thing. Like it's a large thing that you have to be specific about. Yeah, we wanted to get your reaction on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this, everything is cultural and everything is economic in sort of a broad sense. So, like, you sort of can say these things don't mean anything. But I think that the practical benefit of breaking them down into cultural and economic explanations is they suggest different causal mechanisms, different policy responses. And I think what I hear in your question is something along the lines of economics can change culture if you have a sort of a fertility bonus or something. I think that's could be right, but I think that, if you believe that it's not actually directly about affordability or whatever, you might be skeptical of that because you might think, well, the connection is not direct, or it could backfire. Sometimes governments do things and people are turned off by it and turn against it, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think these questions of whether it's cultural or economic does have implications. I mean, what do you do if it's cultural? Well, you stand up and say, children good, children good, children good, right? Shame you for being a childless harlot and so forth, right? Not that, but like, you know what I'm saying? You on the margins, you change how you interact with people and what you incentivize sort of through social sanction or approval or whatever. And then, you could think about, I think that there's a danger in talking about economics because I was reading some article about Korea. That Korea is always just sort of so sad. I mean, they're talking to these young people and they're like just so hostile. And you hear this from China too. I mean, who knows whether the journalists are just looking for what they want to find. But they'll be like, oh, the government won't help me. Oh, my house, I have to afford a house. Oh, it's so hard. And just to it's sort of like when people have a mental illness and you play along with it, you can sort of make it worse. If people think in Korea and advanced country like South Korea, they're too poor to afford children, and you reinforce this idea, I don't know if you're getting them in that direction. You're just reinforcing this sort of self-defeating. They have this cultural value, at their heart where they don't value children compared to everything else in the world. And you are reinforcing that. And so talking about the economics and just saying, we're going to give you another subsidy. We're going to give you a more child bonus. So we're going to, there was this podcast with Ezra Klein, had some sociologist on from Sweden. And she was talking about, parenting is so great. In Sweden, it's like the government does this for you. The government does that for you. And the sort of implication is that, we should do that in America. And she was comparing it culturally, him and her were comparing it culturally to America. And they clearly thought that the Swedish way was better. But then Ezra Klein, because he's a guy who's honest and into truth, says, well, their fertility is actually lower than the United States. I'm like, wait a minute, your entire discussion is nonsense. Your entire discussion is this is a better way to live, and this makes things better for parents, and presumably this would have a positive impact on fertility. But then he has to admit, sort of, it doesn't. So this is sort of why I get sort of uncomfortable when people focus too much on economics.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just think, in line with what Vaish was saying, what does it mean to change the culture? How are you changing the culture? Talking about, I think, a couple of things. I liked your recent piece where you were just talking positively about how fun it is to have kids. Brian Kaplan has influenced me positively that way too. But I also think that, if you make it easier for large families to be wealthy, if you make there less of a trade-off, I don't believe in incentivizing the first baby, because I just think that's a really expensive baby to get somebody to go from 0 to 1, and most of the babies would have been born anyway, and you're at most paying for 10% of those babies wouldn't have been born otherwise if you start paying at the first baby. But I do think paying for the third plus baby could be a very positive policy incentive that would meaningfully change things. And I think when you start seeing large families that are wealthy, when having 3 kids becomes the modal number of kids, culture will change to match that. And I don't think we have a really clear lever other than economics. So that's why I support that. Plus, as a secular person, it's like if I'm going out there and trying to make this pronatalist case and what we should change about our society, it's much easier for me to do that with a political solution than it is with a religious or like I don't, as secular people, we don't have those tools to.
Here's the something that can sort of support your claim. We always end up subsidizing everything that we think is good. For some reason, we subsidize farmers, like even though we don't need to do that. We subsidize retirement. We subsidize sort of things we think people should do or people should have. So yeah, I'm not against these things. Do I think that they change everything on their own or whatever? And maybe probably more on the skeptical sort of end of that. But then to say like this is the only lever we have a lot of levers. I mean, every day in our life we are interacting with other human beings and we are deciding what to talk about and we are deciding what ideas to praise and what lifestyle choices to support or whatever. And so you talked about Brian Kaplan. I mean, he's doing what he's doing. If there was 10 Brian Kaplans and they were all writing for the New York Times and the Atlantic, I mean, I think that would do more for the birth rate than any policy, any economic policy.
Yeah, and I think it would be good to have more female versions of that too, because I think a lot of women look at Brian Kaplan and are like, well, easy for him to say because he's the dad. And I'm like, well, he's a pretty involved dad, it seems like. So I don't think that's totally fair, but I think it would help the message if we had some more female commentators, but yeah, maybe they're too busy breastfeeding all the babies. Anyway, I'll pass it to you.
It was just a random question related to that. Why do you think tech founders in Israel have like 3 kids? Which is like, I kind of witnessed this before I got into the fertility debate. Like a couple of years ago, I went to Israel and it was just like all these people that we met that are like tech founders, CEOs, and they all have at least 3 kids. And it's pretty incredible. I mean, I have a couple of hypotheses, but I want to hear yours first.
So this stuff is mysterious. So it's nothing about tech founders. I mean, Israel is an outlier in first world.
I mean, just like secular people, the outlier in secular people having a lot of kids.
I mean, Israel is just an outlier nationally. And you hear these theories, but then you have to always test them against reality. So somebody said, oh, it's the Palestinian issue. It's like they're under mortal threat. And that somehow psychologically, you can imagine what it does. I don't know. And then I said, okay, I think I said to myself, I think I was talking to myself, not to any person. Like, okay, let's look at Armenia, which just had a war and just lost a bunch of territory and is always being threatened by its neighbor. And its fertility is in the toilet. Look at Ukraine before the war, right? Threatened by Russia. No good, no high fertility. Poland also sort of, you might say, is but the Palestinians and Israelis, they're breeding a lot, and you could come up with a theory as to because they're involved in a war, they both are going to have a lot of kids. The answer is I have no freaking idea. I mean, you look at it and you say, in this sort of historical circumstance, the people wanted to reproduce and they believed in something, and in this circumstance, the Armenians would rather not have kids and be materialistic and go off to go immigrate to the West. I don't have any answer. I don't think anyone does.
I mean, I like one thing I like to speculate on is just the strength of the social contract. So like, it seems as if it's very clear in Israel that that having kids is a pro-social thing, because your kids will like go to the army and like benefit your neighbors and your society in a much more direct way. Like, I think in the West, it's sort of interesting to me that most people don't realize that this is a pyramid scheme and we have to keep moving forward. Like we can't just stop, right? And just that simple economic fact is pretty hard to grasp. And maybe like they've just figured out a way to
I mean, because you look at like it's so endogenous, and because you look at South Korea and look at Taiwan, you could say every child they have is like important because they're threatened by their neighbors, and no, they're rock bottom fertility. So why does it work here? Why does it not work there? I've never heard anything even close to plausible that can that can explain all of these. I think you have to really take population differences into account. I wrote why East Asians stopped having babies. It stopped East Asians. I think Middle Easterners, I think you need a theory of like Middle Easterners under economic or under military threat versus East Asians. And you have to sort of have these different theories because there's not a universal theory that's going to apply to all regions that's going to work.
Yeah, I think that going back to sort of the Sweden, I think it was Sweden you were talking about versus America that you heard on a podcast or whatever, like that example, even though they're lower than the US, they're also a lot less Christian, right? So it could just be
Yeah,
that they would have been even lower without those policies. So I think
and
that's
they were high. And this is the thing about Sweden and Finland and Norway. They were high 10, 15 years ago. And people were saying, oh, this is all great, the welfare state. And now it's collapsed. And no one says this because of the welfare state, because the media likes the welfare state. And they're trying to say we should have that here. So yeah, nobody knows anything.
right.
That's why that's the culture. It's the culture of the gaps, but it's like, it's what we need because we don't have anything else.
I mean, I do think the religiosity is probably a big part of it, just because, I mean, if you look at, and this is the part that does concern me in terms of like, how can we do this with gender equality, not gender equity, like not men and women doing the exact same things and being expected to do the exact same things, but where men's and women's interests are taken into account. Because like historically, people have always been trying to convince women to have more babies. You know, it's not like women were there's always been some kind of social system which prioritized and saw it as a moral positive for women to have a lot of babies. So I think that when you get rid of the religious reason to do that, at best, like people like us, why are we motivated by that? Because we believe that it's going to have some positive impact on the future of humanity, which we care about and or want to be part of that future project through descendants. And I think that on that point, just convincing people that we're not overpopulated is actually the first step.
Yeah.
Like so many people I talk to still buy into the idea that we are overpopulated. It's fundamentally selfish to have kids.
Yeah.
And climate change is, all this stuff. So anyway, I'm reading this really good paper about where they do they look at the projected impacts on climate change of different fertility outcomes, and like even in like a massive fertility boom scenario, they come out that like we'd be 0.1 degrees warmer in 200 years or something like that. So anyway, so I'm gonna write about that, but I do think like the facts of the matter are actually important here, and people still are behind on that piece.
Yeah, I mean, you said that we don't have these cultural levels. I mean, but from what you're saying, it sounds like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I mean, people are not convinced it's a problem. People think it's I don't know. Like, yeah, like, I mean, there are countries that take it seriously, like Japan and Korea. The government is trying to get people to have more children, right? And Japan, I think some people say it actually did work. Daniel Hess told me that it did work because Japan is so much higher than not so much higher, but at least slightly higher than the rest of East Asia. But yeah, in the West, I mean, and this is another thing I talked about with Daniel Hess. He's a guy who runs the Morpers Twitter account that, you go to like most, the comments on a piece on, fertility or whatever, and the New York Times and the readers' picks for the top comments will be like the world's overpopulated. I think like we are, we're sort of in a bubble. We're like smarter than, it's like there's like a level of like person who just reads the headlines of New York Times and leaves a comment versus people who are like, I think if you read The Atlantic or you read The Economist and you read the New York Times, like if you're like the most attentive reader of these newspapers or the most informed, like the top 1%, you're not getting an anti-fertility message. You're getting more of a pro-fertility message, or at least an even. I think if you're at the 90th percentile of being informed, you are getting that negative message because you're getting that global warming is going to kill everyone, and you're not getting the idea that the world is. I mean, who knows? Me and both of you, we don't know what's being taught in public schools. I read something recently. Again, Daniel Hess, I mean, he was talking about how they were, there's some population control organization, and they're like in all these public schools, like showing kids videos about how there's too many people. Like if you're the 99th percentile of an informed sort of citizen, you sort of see Paul Ehrlich and you sort of see him as discredited. He was on 60 Minutes not that long ago, within the last year or two, still, talking about whatever the same things he talks about. I don't remember if it was necessarily a skeptical interview, but he was out there, propagating his views. And so, yeah, there's so much. I mean, there's a lot to do here. You just have to just make people think that having kids is a good thing.
Yeah, I wonder if I wonder if there's something to be gained from looking at the cultures that are doing the worst. So I know you've talked a little bit about the, what is it about East Asian culture? And like one thing that does stand out is both the, meritocratic environment that kids are in, which has a lot of positives, and the way that it interacts with parental investments. These are like very high parental investment cultures. And obviously even here we have like, maybe the parental investment doesn't take the same tiger parenting form, but it still takes a very like involved parenting style. And I wonder if like, we should just push more like French style laissez-faire parenting a lot more. And that's, I know I'm not the first one to mention it. I know Brian Kaplan talked about it, I think, but maybe, yeah, every time we see our neighbors who have a couple of kids, and he's like, he's like talking about how he needs to take his kid to a different sports thing. I'm like, yeah, we need to just like normalize not giving kids everything they want.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this is, yeah, I mean, it seems very related just to anxiety. It's just people are anxious. I mean, and they think the kids are going to be bad for the world, and they think if they have kids, they start to worry about them too much, and the world is dangerous. And yeah, I mean, these are sort of there's a high anxiety versus low anxiety thing here.
Yeah, I have a friend who he buys into the, you're only as happy as your least happy child type of thinking. So therefore he only wants to have one, because therefore his happiness is maximized.
He should have
Like,
zero.
I really want.
Yeah, he should have zero. I mean, why is he having one?
No, because he really wants to have kids. He believes that like having kids makes you a lot happier. He just thinks like the differential between having a bunch of kids and the potential for one of them being a massive fuck up is not worth like rolling the dice multiple times. Because he doesn't believe that.
What if he's the one who's a fuck up? That seems.
Yes, no. But this is premised on you're only as happy as your least happy child. If you believe that you're as happy as if you believe that like having one outstanding kid and one loser kid will make you like median happy,
yeah, I
then
guess that makes sense. I guess it makes sense. Yeah, just one.
But
yeah,
and for those kind of people, I mean, then you might have to make a less self-interested argument. But
it's crazy.
Yeah,
something's gone wrong with his mental model of the world, to be honest. I mean, why would you just be as unhappy as seems like an unstated assumption. I don't know if there's any evidence for that.
I don't know if there's evidence for it, but it is something I've heard a bunch of people say. I think it's just, I think it's rational, right? Like if you're evolved to like care for your kin and one of them's a fuck up, you're going to be spending all your energy trying to fix the fuck up, and it's going to make you really upset that they're not okay. And it may or may not be overwhelmed by the fact that your other one is doing well. I think that you are closer to the average between them than his model thinks, but I think you're definitely tilted towards the lowest, the most distressed child in terms of parental happiness.
Yeah.
From observations.
Yeah. People just need to sort of. Yeah, I mean, again, this is like how much it bothers you. Also, if your kid's not doing well, it's another one of these things. I mean, every issue is like an anxiety issue at the fundamental level, right? It's like, will I have kids? How happy will I be? Will I have kids? How much will it hurt if they're not good or they don't like me or whatever? And yeah, I think we just need to realize sort of how pathologically, anxious we all are, and find ways to make us less so.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that is just saying, I think experiencing anxiety is a better way of talking about it than being an anxious person. I think that's a very negative way of talking. But yeah, just to be clear, I don't think that I don't think either of us are arguing that you shouldn't try to change the culture, that there's no levers that are cultural. Like the one that I'm talking about is informational, which is, I guess, cultural in some sense. But what I think we're both saying is it's frustrating when people say you should change the culture and that's the end of the sentence. It's like you have to say how, otherwise you're not making a reasonable argument against a policy position to achieve that.
It's very interesting. I think you guys, I like to get into sort of the specifics of policy and what's going on in politics. And you should look at sort of what's going on. Like Trump is saying pro-natalist stuff. J.D. Vance is saying pro-natalist stuff. Now, what does it do for the culture if Trump starts running on a pro-natalist message? Does it make people have more kids or less kids? Well, some people probably more, some people probably less. But you do see sort of hints of this. And I think Elon Musk has put it on the map, and sort of whatever the online right is talking about, they're always talking about what Elon is talking about. And then the Republican Party becomes whatever the online right is talking about. And so there is sort of this thing where it's going to become more an explicitly right-wing thing to be pro-natalist. And the question is, how can we make that sure that's good instead of bad? And how can we have a positive? You guys should do some thinking about this, because not many people are thinking about this at all. So.
Yeah, I think that the way to make it good is to just make it very salient for leftists that all those babies are going to be raised conservative and there's going to be a conservative majority, and xenophobic,
Yeah, I mean,
technophobic.
like Israel and
Twitter.
Palestine. I don't know if the hatred in America is that extreme that you're going to really motivate people to do that. But yeah, I think that yes, exactly. These kind of interactions are how we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing I wanted to ask you about, you can go into as much detail you want, but it's more just like a vibes question. Is a bunch of stuff we've interacted with online was to deal with has been to do with the conflict in the Middle East, and I want to know what your reason is for feeling. I would think that you're kind of in the same camp in the sense that you obviously think it's the right position to be pro-Israel, but it's more than that, right? I think Israel is sort of symbolic of like a bunch of things that is happening in our culture, and like, yeah, why are you more passionate and emotional about that issue than many others?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is sort of a hard truth about the state of Palestinian society and what they want and the situation Israel finds itself in. And if you can't recognize the threat that Israel's facing, you're just not good at recognizing threats. And so there's that. There's also just the idea that, like, deep down, I think decolonization was a mistake. I think that Western countries should have been running these other countries indefinitely, and I think Israel having, the survival of Israel matters in a way that the survival of, say, the creation and survival of a Palestinian state does not. It would clearly be a failure, and I haven't seen anyone make a serious argument that if you did give Palestinians everything they wanted, they wouldn't just be a failure like every other Arab regime, either a dictatorship at best or a chaotic sort of civil war kind of situation at worst. And then, there's that. And Israel is just worth defending if you believe in freedom, capitalism, but then also fertility and thinking that there's something good for high birth rates. And then you would think if Israel didn't exist, you wouldn't think that this combination was possible. But high development, high fertility, and pro-biotech. Right, most fertility people, most people who are having more kids are anti-biotech. They're pro-life. They have this religious outlook that frowns on anything unnatural. And Israel doesn't have that. So
even the Haredim are using IVF, I heard, or at least the Orthodox. Yeah,
and so like Israel has, they have some religious fundamentalists that have problems that all religious fundamentalists have, and that I might not necessarily like. But they've got the benefits of religion while excising the worst stuff, what I consider the worst stuff, which is trying to control people's pregnancies. And so, yes, a society worth defending and sort of symbolic of a lot of like the problems. It's a proxy war. The people who hate Israel are the worst people, and the people who like Israel just tend to have a better vision. So it's fun to cheer. There can't be an effective altruist all the time. It's fun to cheer for nations and parties and individuals sometimes.
Oh, I actually have a hot take on that, which is that, like, I actually think like EA style analysis is very incomplete with some of these things. Like, a bunch of EAs won't talk about this issue, for example. And the thing is, like, if you just analyze everything as a static thing where you just count up like how many people are dying and make an expected value, that it just misses something fundamental, which is that these problems are dynamic and in that they're adversarial situations, and with the adversaries responding to how chill you are about it, right? Yeah. So if we were chill about terrorism, we'd get more terrorism. But they seem to analyze it kind of like, how does this compare to AI risk? And it's like, well, they're not analogous in a lot of ways. Yeah. I mean, you could put numbers on everything, but and
I liked your piece on the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Yeah, I mean, it is also sort of, it suffers from a kind of short-termism. It suffers from a kind of sometimes, and this is not a criticism of EA itself. It's just EA has not been done well in analyzing things like conflicts in the Middle East. So yeah, it's worth. Like Bentham, I mean, he's a good guy, but like his stuff on Israel and Palestinian, like, look how many people I'm going to total how many Israelis died on October 7th, and I'm going to total how many Palestinians died, and I'm going to have some idea of justice. It's like, no, that's not how you do it. That's just if you had that attitude, like, we're going to kill equal amounts of these people, the third world, savages would rule the world because they care less about human life. If they killed 3,000 Americans, we could only kill 2,000, and then we have to stop. Like, that would be over. Like, any terrorist group would basically be able to dominate the world, and Israel wouldn't survive like that. And so, yeah, I think this sort of EA sort of rationalist analysis of foreign policy, it's been lacking up to this point, to the extent that it exists.
Yeah, I also think that at least, I don't know if this would count with the EA type of people, but like there is also just a very idealistic, not empirically supported belief that if we wait long enough, everyone will come around to liberal values, and we just need to, give them financial security so that they
Yeah.
can see the beauty
Yeah,
of
that's not a problem with EA.
life in
I
the
think I
West.
think this is just something that they've uncritically accepted just from liberalism. This is sort of liberal establishment thinking, and they've sort of not, had any reason to challenge it. But yes, that is a idea that's sort of out there and really distorts people's thinking.
And this delves into slightly more controversial territory, but there's actually like two things that EA does wrong in this realm, right? One is, the Bentham style analysis, which obviously it's not, it's a little bit naive utilitarianism, because if you play this as a repeated game,
Yeah.
you'll know that it's self-defeating, right? Like the policy. But then the second thing is, EA sort of takes utilitarianism and sneaks in one premise, which is that all lives have equal moral value.
Yes.
That's just, I mean, if you go down the tree to try to explore not just in terms of what are Palestinians and Israelis contributing to the world, but also what is the subjective experience of being a Palestinian versus Israeli.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're not living in equal societies, and so I think those numbers never get puffed up or down as they should as well.
It's genuinely hard to do a calculation. Some people would think that third world people are just, they have a more solid sense of their place in the world and they're happier. It's not as easy, but I think when we bring in our values and say living as a free person is better, and like if we're unsure about which side is happier, I do think the first worlders and more free people are probably happier. And I think there's some data that suggests this, but I'm not that confident in it. But then when we combine that sort of weak belief in that, combined with the strong belief that freedom and people having control of their own lives are inherently good things, then I mean it really does contradict the idea that the implicit idea that all values are equal. This is not just EA's problem. I mean, this is everyone thinks like this, right? This is another one of those things where EA's probably should exist. Best version of EA would be to challenge these kind of PC ideas that aren't that rational once you scrutinize them.
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of the war in general, like I think there's the wokeness response on the other side, which is fine. We've talked a lot about it, but there's also, I think, like we've talked to a bunch of just people that we usually agree with on most things, and I think one thing that came to mind is I'm totally comfortable accepting that people view the historical calculus of the conflict differently, right? You think someone has a better historical game, blah, blah, blah. But I think oftentimes, like what frustrates me is that the other side isn't seeing what you first pointed out, which is like, this is like Palestinian culture is not just another, whatever, even third world culture. I mean, everything I kind of went through the UN Telegram chats that they made into a PDF. I don't know if you went through it. It was a UN employees Telegram chat, and they had a PDF of it. And I went through the appendix and read all the WhatsApp messages. That these weren't like Hamas terrorists. They were just people who were working for the UN and their families talking to each other. And it is just like, I don't know, if you don't get red pilled, kind of seeing that I don't know what.
Were these UN workers Palestinians or?
Yeah, they were Palestinians, and they were talking to, but this was Israel put this out there, and so this is, let's take the most innocuous claim, which is that these are not members of Hamas, right? They're just UN officials. But I thought I would see maybe like celebration of October 7th because because they hate Israel. Instead, actually, what I saw was like pretty straight up like religious pride and kind of just
people don't get the Muslim worldview. These places have violence, and they have bloody borders of Islam, is how you call it, but even within Islam, and there's a lot of fundamentalist religious bigotry there. I mean, this is fundamentally motivates people. I don't think people have, I don't know, like if it's something like the American South, like in the 19th century or something, I think liberals can acknowledge that like a lot of things happen just because the population is very racist and like mean spirited and wants to do bad things. They have a hard time acknowledging that for sort of non-white peoples or for certain modern cultures. And so, yeah, I think that's real. I think the Memory TV, MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, they play videos from people who are in high positions in the Arab world and from media, and just watch some of those videos. They're outliers. They're taking out stuff that's particularly outrageous, but there's a lot of stuff that's really outrageous that they're saying all the time. And you couldn't do that in a lot of other cultures. So it's telling you something.
Yeah, I think we've kept you about 7 minutes past time. So yeah, if that's all from us. If you have nothing else you want to talk about.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say you can find Richard on Twitter, although he hates his Twitter followers, as he said many times.
If you're listening to this podcast, I probably won't hate you. You're probably all right.
And yeah, his Substack is he's pretty prolific, like three times a week or something. Yeah, I'd love to know how you keep your schedule some other time, but anyway, thanks so much for the time. The book is The Origins of Woke. It's also just very interesting to get a little bit of perspective on sort of the legal structure and all the things that surround how laws are made and interpreted. So I got a lot of value out of it from that perspective, as well as from the core thesis. But thanks so much for coming here, Richard. Is there anywhere else you want to direct people to?
No, just the Substack and Twitter. And yeah, I've really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Great. Thank you.